My husband died on a Monday morning in April. He was sitting in his armchair by the window, the one he had sat in every morning for 22 years, with his tea and his newspaper and the particular satisfied stillness of a man who has arranged his life exactly as he wants it. He was 71 years old. He looked peaceful. He had been there, and then he was not, and the space he left behind in that armchair and in that room and in my chest was so immediate and so enormous that I stood in the doorway for a long time before I could bring myself to call anyone. I called our son first. Then the ambulance. Then our daughter. Then our vicar. I made all the calls in the correct order, calmly and practically, because that is who I am. I have always been the practical one, the one who knows what to do next, the one who holds everything steady while the people around me feel the full weight of the moment. I held everything steady through the ambulance arriving, through the calls to the funeral home, through the stream of neighbors with casseroles and the flowers that filled every surface until the house smelled overwhelmingly of lilies. I held it steady through the funeral, which was beautiful, which was full of people who spoke genuinely and at length about what a good man my husband had been. And then, for days after we buried him, a woman I had never seen before in my life knocked on my front door. She was about 40. She had dark hair and careful eyes, and she was holding a bunch of white flowers that she had clearly bought specifically for this visit, and she stood on my doorstep looking at me with an expression I recognized, even then, as the expression of someone who has rehearsed what they are about to say many times and still isn't sure any version of it is going to be adequate. She said, "Mrs. Calloway. My name is Anna. I am so sorry for your loss. I need to tell you something about your husband. I have needed to tell you for a long time. I am so sorry it is happening now. My name is Margaret Calloway. I was married to Edward for 48 years. I loved him completely. And on the Friday after his funeral, standing at my own front door, I began to understand that I had also, in some essential way, never known him at all. This is the story of what Anna told me. What I did with what she told me. And what I found, on the other side of the most disorienting year of my life, waiting for me. I need to tell you about Edward before I tell you what I found out about him. Because without understanding who he was to me, who I genuinely believed him to be for 48 years, the rest of this story doesn't carry the weight it actually carried. I met Edward Calloway when I was 23 years old, at a dance at the town hall. He asked me to dance and then talk to me for the rest of the evening about history, which was his subject. He was a secondary school history teacher, which he would remain his entire working life. He was 26, already slightly professorial, with the kind of focused attentiveness that made you feel, when he was talking to you, that you were the most interesting person in any room. I fell in love with that attentiveness first, before anything else. Before his humor, which was dry and quick and occasionally devastating. Before his patience, which was genuine and deep. Before his steadiness, which I had always taken to be one of his finest qualities and which I would eventually come to understand in a more complicated way. We married in 1976 when I was 24 and he was 27. We had a small wedding in the village church where my parents had married, and a reception in the local pub, and Edward cried during the vows, which surprised me and which I have thought about many times since. We had 2 children. Our son, James, born in 1978. Our daughter, Catherine, born in 1981. We raised them in the same house we bought when James was a baby, a 3-bedroom semi in a quiet street, where we would remain for the next 4 decades. Edward was a good father. Consistently, genuinely good in ways that are easy to overlook because they are not dramatic. He was simply always there, at the dinner table, at school plays, at sports days, at every ordinary occasion where a father's presence matters. He helped with homework. He drove children to activities without complaint. He remembered names of friends and teachers and spoke to our children with real interest about their lives. He was a good husband. I want to be precise about this, because it matters to understanding how completely what came next disoriented me. Edward was not a passionate man in the obvious sense. He was not given to grand gestures or romantic speeches. But he was, for 48 years, consistently kind, consistently present, consistently attentive in the small daily ways that I have always thought matter more than the grand ones. He cooked Sunday lunch every week without exception, a habit he had started in the first year of our marriage and continued for 47 years. He remembered every significant date, not just birthdays and anniversaries but smaller things, the anniversary of my mother's death, the date of my first teaching job, the day we got our first dog. He never went to sleep on an argument, a principle he maintained so consistently that I had occasionally found myself wanting to argue a little longer simply because I was not quite finished, only to find Edward already looking for a way to resolution. I am telling you all of this not to make what follows more shocking, though it will inevitably seem that way. I am telling you because I think it is important that you understand Edward was genuinely these things, genuinely kind, genuinely attentive, genuinely present, and that what I found out about him does not erase any of it. But it changes the picture. It changes the picture in ways that took me the better part of a year to fully process. Edward retired at 63. He joined a local history society and a walking group and a book club, which he attended with a seriousness of purpose that I found both endearing and slightly amusing. He continued cooking Sunday lunch. He sat in his armchair by the window every morning with his tea and his newspaper. He died on a Monday in April, peacefully, in the armchair, at 71. And on the Friday, Anna knocked on my door. I asked her in. I am not entirely sure why. Something about the way she was standing there, the flowers, the rehearsed expression, the obvious weight of what she was about to say, told me that closing the door would not make it go away. We sat at my kitchen table. I made tea, automatically, the way I make tea in any situation requiring steadiness. Anna said, I don't know where to begin, so I am going to begin at the beginning, and I ask you to please let me finish before you respond, because I know that some of what I am going to say will be very difficult to hear. I said I would let her finish. She said she had known Edward for 19 years. She had met him through the local history society, the same local history society he had joined upon retirement, which he had attended every Tuesday evening for 8 years, which he had always come home from talking with enthusiasm about whatever topic had been discussed that week. She said their friendship had begun as exactly that. A genuine friendship, built around a shared passion for local history, which they had both taken seriously and which had produced, over several years, a jointly written monograph on the town's Victorian mill buildings that had been published by a small local press and which I actually owned a copy of, which Edward had given me, which I had read with genuine interest, which had Anna's name on the cover alongside his. I had known about Anna. I had known about the book. I had known about the History Society. None of that was secret. I had met Anna once, briefly, at a society event I had attended with Edward perhaps 6 years earlier. I had thought she seemed interesting. I had thought nothing more about her. Then Anna told me the rest. The friendship had become something more, she said, about 12 years ago. Not a dramatic, sudden thing, a gradual deepening over time, built on the same attentive conversations, the same focused interest in each other, that I was now recognizing as the specific quality I had fallen in love with in Edward 50 years earlier. She said she had not intended it. She said she believed he had not intended it either. She said she was not telling me this to excuse anything or to explain anything away. I said, You are telling me you were in love with my husband. She said, yes. And he was in love with me. For 12 years. I sat with that for a very long time. The tea went cold. The kitchen was completely quiet. Outside I could hear my neighbor's lawnmower, which struck me as so completely ordinary and so completely wrong for the moment that I almost laughed. I said, Why are you telling me now? Anna said, Because he asked me to. He left me a letter, before he died. He had not been well, not seriously, he hadn't told you or anyone how much the heart condition had actually been limiting him. But he knew. He knew he did not have much longer, and he wrote me a letter, and the letter said, among other things, that he believed you deserved to know the truth. That he had wanted to tell you himself, for years, and that he had never been able to find a way to do it that did not feel like it would destroy everything. And that if he died before he told you, he asked me to come and tell you himself. He asked me to tell you he was sorry. He asked me to tell you that his love for you was completely real. And he asked me to give you this. She put a sealed envelope on my kitchen table. My name was on it, in Edward's handwriting. I did not open it while Anna was there. I thanked her for coming. I showed her to the door. I stood in my hallway for a long time. Then I went back to the kitchen and I picked up the envelope and I opened it. I want to tell you about the letter, but I want to be careful, because it belongs to me and it was written for me, and I am not going to share every word of it here. What I will tell you is this: it was 8 pages long, handwritten, in Edward's very particular handwriting that I had known for nearly 50 years. It began with the words, "My darling Margaret. If you are reading this, then I have not been brave enough. I am so sorry." He did not make excuses. That was the first thing that struck me, reading it, how little of the letter was given over to explaining or justifying. There was context, but it was offered carefully and briefly, not in the manner of a man building a defense, but in the manner of a man trying to give a complete picture. He wrote about how his friendship with Anna had begun and grown and changed. He wrote about the years of sitting with that change and not knowing what to do with it, not because he loved me less, he said, which was true and which he needed me to know was true, but because he had always been, in his own words, a man more capable of feeling 2 things at once than of resolving them. He wrote about specific moments from our marriage that he treasured: the birth of both children, a particular holiday in Scotland in 1994, the day we got our first dog, the Sunday lunches, in a way that was so specific and so detailed that I recognized, reading it, that these were not things he had invented for the letter. They were things he had genuinely carried. He wrote about the heart condition. He had known for 3 years that it was worsening. He had managed the information carefully, not lying to me exactly, but giving me the softened version, the one that allowed me to believe he was being appropriately monitored and was in no immediate danger. I want to be honest, this particular piece of information, the deliberate management of his own health news, made me more angry than anything else in the letter. More angry than Anna. Because it felt like the place where his protection of himself, of his carefully maintained ordinary life, had cost me something real. Time I might have used differently. Conversations I might have had. He wrote, "I have spent 48 years being a man who holds things together. I am now understanding that holding things together and being honest are not always the same thing, and that I have too often chosen the first at the cost of the second. I am sorry for that more than I can write." He wrote that he wanted me to do something after reading the letter. Not to forgive him, he said specifically. He was not asking for forgiveness because it was not, in his view, his to ask for. He wanted me to decide, for myself, what the truth meant for me. Not what it meant about him. What it meant for me. The last paragraph said, "You are the steadiest person I have ever known. You have been steady for everyone around you your whole life. Please, for once, let yourself not be steady for a while. Let yourself feel whatever you actually feel about this without managing it or holding it together. You are allowed." I should have said that to you more often. I should have said many things more often. I folded the letter very carefully. I put it back in the envelope. Then I sat at my kitchen table, and for the first time since Edward had died, I stopped being steady. I cried for a very long time. Not quietly. Not practically. Completely. I did not tell James and Catherine immediately. I needed time with what I knew before I put it in front of anyone else. I took 3 weeks. 3 weeks in which I went through the ordinary motions of early bereavement, thank you letters, estate paperwork, sorting through Edward's study, while carrying this new information that sat in my chest like a stone that had not yet found the right place to settle. During those 3 weeks I made a decision that I want to tell you about because I think it mattered enormously to what came after. I went back through my memories of the last 12 years specifically. Not searching for proof, I was not interested in that kind of archaeology. But trying honestly to answer a question, had I known, in some quiet unacknowledged part of myself, that something was different? And the honest answer, which took me the full 3 weeks to arrive at, was, not exactly. Not consciously. But there had been things I had chosen not to examine too closely. Tuesday evenings that ran slightly later than the History Society meeting should have needed. A warmth in Edward's manner when he spoke about his History Society work that I had read as enthusiasm for the subject and had not looked further into. A quality of contentment in him during his retirement years that I had attributed to the relief of no longer working, and which I now understood had other sources. I am not telling you this to suggest I should have known, or that I was naive, or that I somehow failed to pay attention. I am telling you because the honest accounting mattered to me. I needed to know what was real and what I had constructed retrospectively. After 3 weeks, I called James first. Then Catherine. I asked them each to come for the weekend. I did not tell them why. I told them on a Saturday morning, at the kitchen table, with tea, because that is apparently where my life has always taken place. James went very quiet. He is the more contained of my 2 children, the one who processes inward before he speaks, and the silence he went into after I told him lasted about 15 minutes, during which he sat very still and I watched his face and thought about how much he looks like Edward and what it costs to hold that thought. Catherine cried immediately and then, almost immediately after the crying, became angry, not at me, and surprisingly not at her father initially, but at the situation itself, at the unfairness of finding this out after he was gone, at the impossibility of the conversation she would now never be able to have with him. She said, he should have told us. He should have told you himself, while he was still here to answer for it. I said, yes. He should have. James said, eventually, still very quietly, Mum, what do you want from us? What are you needing us to do with this? I said, I don't know yet. I think I just needed you to know because it is too heavy to carry alone. Catherine came and sat beside me and held my hand for a long time without speaking. James made more tea, badly, in the way that he has always made tea, too strong, left too long, and brought it over without comment, and we sat with our too strong tea and our impossible morning, and I thought, these 2 people, this table, these 2 faces that carry their father's features in different ways. This is what he also was. This is also real. Then James said, what about the woman? Anna? Are you going to see her again? I had been asking myself exactly that question for 3 weeks. I said, I think I might need to. I called Anna 6 weeks after her first visit. I want to be honest about why, because my children, particularly Catherine, were not entirely sure it was a good idea, and their concern came from love, so it deserves honest engagement. I called Anna because I had a list of questions that I could not answer from a letter and a 3-week private excavation of my own memories. I called her because Edward had asked her to tell me the truth, and the truth had more dimensions than one conversation on a doorstep with rehearsed flowers had been able to cover. I called her because I am, fundamentally, a person who needs to understand things fully before I can decide what I actually feel about them. And, if I am being completely honest, I called her because the letter had said something that I had not been able to stop thinking about for 6 weeks. Edward had written, Anna knows things about me that I have never told anyone else. Not because they are shameful. Because they are the parts of myself I never knew how to bring into the life we shared. I should have. I am sorry I didn't. But she knows them, and if you are willing, I think hearing them might give you a more complete picture of who I actually was than the picture I was able to give you myself. The parts of himself he never knew how to bring into the life we shared. I needed to know what that meant. We met at a cafe in the town center. Neutral territory. I arrived first, deliberately, so that I could choose the table and the seating and have a moment to settle before she arrived. Anna arrived on time, without flowers this time, with the same careful expression she had worn on my doorstep, but without the rehearsal tension. She seemed, if anything, slightly more settled, as though the first conversation had cost her a great deal and this one had already done its worst simply by being agreed to. We talked for almost 3 hours. I am going to tell you the most important things she told me, because I think they are the heart of what this whole story is actually about. She told me that Edward had, for most of his adult life, carried a profound anxiety about his own adequacy, as a husband, as a father, as a person, that he had managed through a kind of relentless reliability. The Sunday lunches, the remembered dates, the consistent presence. She said these things had been completely genuine. She wanted me to be clear on that. It was not performance, but that they had also been, in part, how Edward managed the private fear that without them he would somehow be found lacking. She said, he told me once that being married to you was the safest he had ever felt in his life. But that safe also meant contained. That there were things he wanted to say or be that he was afraid of bringing into your marriage because he didn't want to disturb something that felt precious to him. So he kept them separate. I said, what kinds of things? She said, he wrote poetry. Since he was in his 30s. He never showed you any of it. He showed me some of it and it was very good, Margaret. It was genuinely good. He was embarrassed by it. He thought you would find it pretentious. I stared at her. I said, he thought I would find it pretentious. She said, I know. I told him that. More than once. He was stubborn about some things. I thought about Edward for a moment. I thought about the dry humor and the history books and the Sunday lunches and 48 years of mornings I thought I knew completely. I said, is there more? She said, he was terrified of dying. He never told you because he didn't want to burden you with it. He said you had always been the steady one and he didn't want to be the thing that destabilized your steadiness. The same word as in his letter. Steady. The quality I had always taken as my identity, as something I had chosen, now appearing before me as something Edward had also required of me, had relied on so completely that he had hidden his own fear rather than ask me to be something other than steady for him. I sat with that for a long time. Then I asked the question I had been building toward since the first doorstep conversation. I said, Anna, did he love you the way he loved me? Or was it something different? She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I think he loved us in ways that were completely incompatible with each other and that he could never find a way to resolve, so he simply held both of them at the same time for 12 years and called it living. I think you gave him the life he actually had. I think I gave him the version of himself he was afraid to be within that life. I don't think either of us was more real to him than the other. I think that is its own kind of tragedy. I went home and I sat in Edward's armchair by the window, for the first time since he died. I sat there for a very long time. 3 months after Edward's death, Anna sent me a package in the post. Inside was a handwritten notebook, dark green, slightly worn at the corners. There was a note from Anna that said simply, he would have wanted you to have this, I think, in the end. Even if he was never able to give it to you himself. It was Edward's poetry. A full notebook of it, covering what appeared from context to be roughly a decade of writing. Dated entries. Careful handwriting, smaller than his usual hand, as though he had been writing more privately than he usually wrote. I want to tell you about reading it because I think it was the moment that changed the most inside me, more than Anna's doorstep visit, more than the letter, more than the cafe conversation. The poetry was, as Anna had said, genuinely good. I am not a person who says things like that easily, and I say it now with full awareness that I might be biased in any number of directions. But it was good. It was specific and precise and occasionally funny in the way that Edward's humor had always been dry and quick, and it was emotionally honest in a way that Edward's conversation had never quite been. Some of the poems were about Anna. I want to be honest about this rather than gloss over it. Reading them cost me something real. But more of them, many more of them, were about me. About our marriage. About James and Catherine. About the house and the garden and the Sunday lunches and the armchair by the window. Written with the same specificity and precision as the historical research he had always loved, as though he had studied our life together with the same attention he gave to Victorian mill buildings. One of them was about the morning James was born. It was 3 stanzas long, and it described, in complete and exact detail, the way the light had come through the hospital window at 6 in the morning, and the sound of the ward around us, and the specific weight and heat of a newborn placed in his arms for the first time. I had been there for that morning. I remembered it. Reading Edward's version of it, in his careful private handwriting, I understood for the first time that he had held that morning inside him with the same completeness and precision with which he held everything he considered important, and had simply never found a way to say so. There was one about me specifically, about watching me sleep, written in a tone that was so quiet and so full of a love that had nowhere to go other than the page, that I had to put the notebook down and walk to the window and look out at the garden for a long time before I could continue reading. There was one about the fear of death. About lying awake at night, which I had not known he did. About the specific terror of leaving before he had said the things that needed saying. About trying to be brave enough and consistently failing. He had written, "She will be steady when I am gone. She will hold it together for everyone." I love this about her, and I grieve it at the same time, because I have never found a way to tell her that I am also afraid and that I needed her to be unsteady with me just once. I want to be very honest with you about what happened inside me, reading that line. Something shifted. Something that had been hardening over the 3 months since Anna's doorstep visit, a protective hardness, the kind you build around an injury to keep it from being touched, shifted and softened into something more complicated. Not forgiveness. I am not sure forgiveness is the right word for what happened in me. But understanding. A genuine, complete understanding of who Edward actually was, including the parts one had not been allowed to see, which included, I was now able to acknowledge, the part of him that had been too afraid of my steadiness to be unsteady in my presence. Who had hidden a secret life not only from selfishness but from a love that had become, over decades, slightly too careful of me to be completely honest with me. That was the most complicated thing I had to sit with. The love had been real. The hiding had also come from the love, in a twisted way. And I could see now, contributed to it, by being the steady one, the practical one, the one who held everything together. I had made it harder for Edward to be the one falling apart. I put the notebook in my bedside drawer. I have kept it there since. The year after Edward's death was the strangest year of my life, and I want to tell you about it honestly because I think it is the part people least expect and the part that mattered most. I had expected grief. I had been prepared for grief. I had not been prepared for the particular complexity of grieving a person who turned out to be both who you thought they were and someone else entirely at the same time. Because both of those things were true simultaneously. Edward had been exactly the kind, attentive, steadily present man I had believed him to be for 48 years. He had also been a man with an inner life he had never fully shared with me, a parallel relationship he had maintained for 12 years, and a fear of death he had borne alone rather than asking me to bear it with him. The grief for the man I knew was simple, in the way grief is simple, enormous and immediate and physical in its presence. The grief for the man I hadn't known was different. More confusing. More prone to arriving unexpectedly, reading the poetry, or sitting in his armchair, or finding a receipt from somewhere he had told me he was going to the History Society. I went to see a grief counselor. I want to say this plainly because I think women of my generation, I am 72, are sometimes reluctant to seek that kind of support, as though needing it suggests a weakness in the steadiness that has always defined us. I went because Edward's letter had told me to stop being steady for a while and let myself feel things, and because I had realized that doing that alone, in my kitchen, with cold tea and a green notebook, was not sufficient. My counselor's name was Susan. She was about 50, calm and precise, and not given to easy reassurance. She was exactly what I needed. Susan said something in our second session that I have thought about many times since. She said, "Margaret, it sounds like Edward spent 48 years protecting you from the parts of himself that felt too messy. What I'm wondering is whether anyone in your life has protected you from anything, or whether protection has always been the thing that flows in one direction, from you outward." I said, "I have always been the practical one." She said, "Yes. But whose decision was that?" I did not have an immediate answer. I went home and I thought about it for a week. And I came back and I said, "Mine. Mostly mine." I think I chose steadiness very early on because it made me valuable and necessary, and those things felt safe. And I kept choosing it without ever really examining what it was costing. Susan said, "And what was it costing?" I thought about this for a long time. Then I said, "Edward." Among other things. Because the steadiness that made me feel safe also made it impossible for him to bring his messier parts to me, because he knew I would manage them rather than feel them with him. And so he took them somewhere else. Susan said, "That's a very clear-eyed analysis. How does it feel to say it?" I said, "It feels true. And it feels grief-inducing. And it does not change what he did. And it changes how I understand it." I went to Susan every 2 weeks for 11 months. It is the single best thing I have done for myself in my adult life, and I say that as someone who has made some good decisions. I also, during that year, did several things that were out of character for the person I had always been. I did not cook Sunday lunch for 3 months. Not for any dramatic reason. Simply because I did not want to, and for the first time in my adult life I was not performing a role for anyone's benefit, including my own. I ate what I wanted when I wanted. It was disorienting, and then it was liberating in a small but real way. I read widely and badly, books I would never ordinarily have chosen, including 2 novels I gave up halfway through and felt no guilt about, a habit of completion that I had held since childhood and which I discovered I had no particular use for anymore. I redecorated the living room. This sounds trivial. It was not trivial. The living room had been the same for 22 years, decorated to a compromise that suited both of us and neither of us completely. I repainted it a color I loved and Edward had always found garish, and I put different furniture in it, and I stood in the middle of it when I was finished and felt something small but genuine that I can only describe as the specific satisfaction of a space being entirely your own. I spoke to Anna 3 more times that year. Not regularly. Not as anything approaching friends. But honestly, each time, in a way that gave me things I would not otherwise have had. She gave me copies of some of the local history research she and Edward had done together, not the published work I already had, but the private notes, the correspondence with archives, the process of research rather than the product. Reading it gave me something I had not expected, a picture of Edward's intellectual life that was richer and stranger and more passionate than the version he had been willing to show me. I put all of these things together over the course of that year. The letter. The poetry. Susan's sessions. The Anna conversations. The living room. The Sunday lunches I stopped making and then, eventually, started making again when I wanted to rather than because it was Sunday. At the end of that year, I had arrived somewhere. Not resolution, I want to be careful about that word, because I do not think what happened between me and the truth of my marriage has a resolution in the clean sense. But a resting place. A place from which I could see the whole picture, Edward exactly as he was, complicated and loving and cowardly and genuine, without the picture feeling like an indictment of the life we had shared, because it was not an indictment. It was simply the whole truth, which is always more complicated than the partial truth we live inside while it is happening. I want to tell you where my children ended up, because their journeys through this year mattered enormously and were very different from each other. Catherine was angry for a long time. Not a simple anger, she is too intelligent for simple anger, but a complicated, layered anger at her father for the hiding, at herself for not having noticed, and, more quietly, at the version of family life she had believed in, which now required reassessment. She and I had the most honest conversations we have ever had during that year. About her father. About me. About the kind of marriage she had grown up watching and what it had taught her about love and partnership. She is in a relationship now that she describes, with characteristic directness, as deliberately more honest than anything I saw at home, which sets a fairly low bar but which I intend to exceed. I said, the bar was not as low as you think. It was complicated. Those are different things. She said, I know, Mum. I know that now. James processed differently. James sat with the information quietly for several months and then, on a Sunday visit perhaps 8 months after I had told them both, said something that I have kept. He said, Mum, I've been thinking about Dad. About the way he was always there, always consistent, always doing the right thing. And I used to think that was just who he was, just his character. But now I think it was also partly what he owed. Does that make sense? Like the consistency wasn't just love. It was also compensation. For what he was keeping separate. I said, yes. I think that's right. He said, and I think I've spent my whole life trying to be like him. To be reliable, consistent, always there. And I'm not sure I've ever examined whether I'm doing it because I want to or because I think that's what good men look like. I looked at my son, steady, kind, slightly too serious, a little too careful, unmistakably his father's child, and I thought, the most unexpected thing that has come out of this entire year is that it has given my children the opportunity to understand their father more completely than they did when he was alive. And to understand themselves through that understanding. Both of them have spoken to their own counselors during this year. I am proud of this in a way I find difficult to articulate, proud that they sought support rather than managing quietly, which is the lesson I most wished Edward had learned and most needed to learn myself. I have not told anyone else. Not the neighbors. Not the friends who attended the funeral and spoke about what a good man Edward was. Not the History Society who wrote me a kind letter of condolence. Some truths are not for everyone. Some truths belong only to the people they most directly affect. I have kept the poetry notebook in my bedside drawer. I read it occasionally. Less often now than in the first year, but still. It is the most complete picture I have of who Edward actually was, and I find that I am grateful for it, which is not an emotion I would have predicted in those first weeks. Anna and I do not have an ongoing relationship. We have spoken perhaps 4 times in the past year. She is a person I will always have a specific and unclassifiable connection to, the person who told me the truth about my own marriage, at the request of the man I shared it with, which makes her role in my life genuinely unlike anything I have language for. She told me once, in one of our calls, that she had been afraid I would hate her. I said, did I? She said, no. You were incredibly dignified about the whole thing. I don't know how. I said, I've had a lot of practice. We both laughed, which felt strange and then felt right. I want to say something to everyone watching this about what this year has actually taught me, because I am 72 years old and I have spent a great deal of that year thinking carefully about what I want to take from it. The first thing, knowing the complete truth about someone you love does not erase the love. It changes the picture. It adds dimensions that were not there before. It makes certain things more painful and certain things, unexpectedly, more meaningful. But it does not undo 48 years of genuine love and genuine partnership, any more than finding a crack in the foundation of a house undoes the 48 years of life lived inside it. The second thing, steadiness is not the same as strength. I have spent my entire adult life being the steady one, the practical one, the one who holds everything together, the one who does not fall apart. I believed this was a virtue. It is a virtue. It is also, I now understand, a choice that has costs attached to it that I never fully examined. The cost of being the steady one is that the people around you come to depend on your steadiness in ways that can leave them unable to bring you their unsteadiness. You become the person who holds things rather than the person who can be held. Edward needed someone to be unsteady with. He found that in Anna because he could not find a way to bring it to me. I do not entirely blame him for that. I do not entirely absolve myself of contribution to it. Both of those things are true at once, which is the definition of a complicated marriage, which is to say the definition of most real marriages. The third thing, and this is the thing I most want every person watching this to hear, tell people the true things while you can still tell them yourself. Edward wrote the letter. He asked Anna to deliver it. He did what he could, at the last moment, to give me the truth. But it came after. It came in the wrong order, delivered by someone else, received at the worst possible time, without the possibility of conversation or response or the particular kind of understanding that can only happen between two people sitting in the same room still able to hold each other. He was afraid. He was a man more capable of feeling two things at once than of resolving them, and so he held the things separately until there was no more time. Tell the true thing. Not the version of it that protects you from the discomfort of the other person's response. The real true thing. While you are here. While there is still time for it to be something that creates understanding rather than something that arrives, sealed in an envelope, to be read alone at a kitchen table with cold tea. I am 72 years old. I live alone in the house I shared with Edward for 44 years. I have repainted the living room a color he would have found garish and which I find exactly right. I have a green notebook in my bedside drawer. I have 2 children who are both, in their different ways, doing the hard work of becoming more honest versions of themselves. I have a counselor named Susan whom I still see every month, because I have decided that being the steady one does not require me to do everything alone. I make Sunday lunch when I want to. Not every week. When I want to. I am not the same person I was before Anna knocked on my door. I am not sure I would go back to that person, even if I could. Some truths are worth having, even when the having of them costs everything it costs. If Margaret's story stayed with you, please give this video a like and subscribe. We share complete, powerful stories every single week. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. And tell me in the comments, what moved you most? The letter, the poetry, the counselor, or Margaret's final word about steadiness? I read every single comment. Every one.